Hello and welcome today to today's ICEAA webinar. It's hosted by the ICEAA OEM Cooperative Opportunities Group. I'm John Deem, a cost analyst at Lockheed Martin and a member of this ICEAA OEM Cooperative Opportunities Group. And today I have the pleasure introducing Ms. Erica Walters from OSD CAPE, who's going to share an overview of the recently revised DoD handbook on inflation and escalation. In prior discussions with Erica, we learned that OSD CAPE is hoping to get the message out to the broader cost community on how DoD is looking at inflation and escalation in a new, more appropriate way. And, you know, collectively, we all appreciate you, our audience, joining us to hear this message from Erica and be part of that mission. So, and just so you know, for this discussion today, Erica has a lot of content to throw at us to digest. So if you have any questions as you think of them, go ahead and throw them in the chat and we will address them at the appropriate time later in the meeting. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Erica.
Thanks, John and Megan. This is Erica Walters from OSD CAPE. I'm going to try to share my screen now. We'll see how this goes. I'm briefing you today from my ancient grad school laptop. So we'll see if this works here. All right. So it looks like I'm sharing my screen now, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. And before we start with the actual briefing material, I want everybody to take a look at this intro level slide. So this is a self-assessment, and I want everybody to look through the different sets of terminology on the right side of the slide and just do a quick self-assessment on which set you're comfortable with, both in theory and in practice. And this starts to give you a sense of how the terminology has evolved over time. So you don't have to volunteer in the chat or anything what level you think you're at here, but just for your own kind of self-awareness, thinking about where you're coming in today. The goal for this briefing is not to make you an expert in inflation and escalation and how to calculate using the two, but to maybe get you one level higher than wherever you came in today, or at least find out that there are other levels up above where you might have been in the past. So I'll introduce the material to you and then talk about our updated handbook and where you can go to find more information about these sets of terms. So with that, let's jump into the briefing itself. All right, so this is our briefing on the inflation and escalation best practices for cost analysis. That's also the name of our handbook, which is available on the CAPE public website. You can see the URL on the slide here. You can also just Google OSD CAPE, and you'll see that there's a link within the website that says public reports, and that's where the inflation handbook lives. There are also a bunch of other reports on there that might be of interest to you if you've never seen them before. So we have the DoD cost estimating guide. There was a briefing on that at ICEAA a few weeks ago. We have an operations and support cost estimating guide, a handbook for analysis of alternatives and how to do cost estimates for those specifically, as well as our annual reports if you're curious about the types of work that CAPE does in general. All of that is on our public website. For anyone who's not familiar with CAPE in general, we are a cost assessment and program evaluation office. So I work on the cost assessment side, CA of CAPE, and the PE side does a little bit more budgety kind of work compared to the cost assessment side. So we do the same types of work as the service cost agencies, so like the Air Force Cost Analysis Agency, DASA CE for the Army, and NCCA FMB6 was the old name for the Navy one. Now it's at the SysCom level, but you've probably worked with some level of DoD cost estimators before. CAPE is the kind of headquarters DoD version of that does independent cost estimates, mostly for milestone decisions. And we also have a statutory authority to review the inflation and escalation indices that the department uses. So that's kind of where we come in on the inflation escalation front. And then by way of my own background, so I'm a cost estimator in the Land and Naval Warfare Cost Analysis Division. So my primary function is to do estimates for ship programs. And as kind of an additional duty, I got assigned this inflation escalation policy work, as well as more general policy things. So I've actually briefed this group once before on CAPE policy in general and all the different handbooks and DoD instructions and manuals that we have and how all that kind of works together. But today we're talking specifically about inflation and escalation. So some background on the topic first. Cost analysis requires proper accounting for growth in the prices of military commodities. And so that's probably nothing new to the people who are on the line here. You know, that's the whole purpose of cost estimating, is figure out what's going to happen with prices in the future. So that includes inflation and escalation. And inflation is economy-wide. There's only one rate of inflation for everybody because it has to do with the purchasing power of the dollar. If you're talking about anything other than the value of the US dollar, you're talking about commodity-specific price escalation. And the fact that those terms are different from each other was kind of a new concept back in the 2015 timeframe, which is when the DoD committed to this new methodology that distinguishes those two things from each other. But there wasn't a consistent understanding or application of those terms across the cost analyses that we saw from all these different offices within the DoD. And that's a problem because if you aren't accounting for the change in prices properly, then you could be putting the wrong amount into your budgets. You could be making make-buy decisions that are skewed. Affordability assessments can be off, or at the very least, you'll create difficulty in tracing estimates over time if you and I are using different indices and we don't realize it. And so it's important to have a consistent use of indices, consistent ways of calculating these things, so that we can stop talking about inflation and escalation and talk about the kind of more interesting things that make DoD programs unique. So since we were seeing this inconsistency across the board, that's where I got assigned to update our handbook. It's been out since 2017, but this was a pretty significant overhaul that we did more recently. And so today I'm going to talk through the actual contents of the handbook so that you can go look at it on your own and start to digest the material, because there is a lot of information in there. So before we get too much into how to do calculations, I want to talk about the theory and terminology a little bit more. So this graphic here is kind of old, actually. It was in our 2017 version of the Inflation Escalation Handbook, and it's a framework for understanding the terms that I'm about to talk to you about in the context of specific calculations. So if I was to take historical data out of any system that's collecting historical costs, I could graph them over time, right? Stick them into Excel, generate a graph. And I might come up with something like the black line in the middle of the graph here. And that's just showing, you know, starting at the beginning, we've got some increases, some decreases, it's kind of bounced all over the place. But if all I have is the total cost data, I want to understand what was actually happening at these different points in time. And so it's our job as cost estimators. Oh, I just got kicked out of my briefing. Let's try that again. All right, it's our job as cost estimators to figure out what is driving those changes. And so we might break things down into categories, kind of like the ones you're seeing on the slide here. So first, at the top of the sand chart, we've got inflation. Inflation is always happening to everything because we're buying everything with US dollars. And so the changing value of the US dollar is going to impact everything we buy no matter what it is. So that's the inflation piece. It's the same for everybody. But then depending on what commodity you're looking at here, whether it's a specific weapons system, a specific contract for a weapons system, or even at the top level, the entire DoD budget, whatever level of detail you're looking at here, there's going to be some specific stuff that's happening to that commodity in addition to or counteracting inflation. So you can see the buckets here. We've got, for example, specific market prices. Maybe you have a lot of steel in your commodity and the prices for steel are growing at a faster rate than inflation. That's what you'd be seeing in this example here, because that price wedge is widening over time. So if you have a particular market of interest to what you're doing, whether that's a material or specific labor categories that are experiencing price fluctuations, that's kind of what we think about for specific market prices. You could also have some business effects on the particular contractor that you're looking at, or a mix of contractors. You can see some of the examples labeled on the chart would be changes in union contracts or pension shock. This is where you'd account for things like the pay rates of a particular contractor changing over time, because that would sort of play into inflation, right? Contractors are a part of the economy that are experiencing inflation. But if you are looking at a particular subset, it's unlikely that things are tracking perfectly to inflation, which is why you have to account for them separately and understand what's going on. And then the lightest blue section of this graph is the program content, quality and quantity section. So this is kind of the government making decisions. If you had a change in requirements at a particular point in time that made the costs go up, if you increased orders and so the per item cost is down, whatever it might be, that's another thing that can influence the cost of systems over time. And so you can see towards the right side of the slide here, the terms that we're going to start using throughout the rest of the briefing, which are inflation, escalation, and real price change. So we've already talked about inflation, that's the overall economy-wide US dollar rate of change. All of those other things that are more specific to the commodity that you're looking at are collectively referred to as real price change, and those can vary depending on what you're looking at. And the combined effect of real price change and inflation together is what we call escalation. So it used to be that people would just kind of use the word inflation to refer to all kinds of things, but we are specifically using these different terms because sometimes you want to use one versus the other in your calculations. You can imagine there might be a situation where you're looking at your historical data and all you want to do is take inflation away, and you want to look at what's left over when inflation is out of the picture. That would be looking at things in what we call constant year dollars. But there are other times that you might want to normalize for inflation and the price of steel, or inflation and a change in labor category prices, or whatever that is. So it just depends on what you're doing. And it's important to have those precise terms so you can communicate to people what you're doing and why, and make sure that if we're comparing numbers, we're comparing the same kinds of numbers. So this is a conceptual framework. We call it the Economist's framework because these are terms that economists might think of when they are developing price indices. But they're not necessarily the buckets that you'd think of if you're building a cost estimate from scratch. And so one of our jobs with the latest handbook update was to take this conceptual framework and translate it into cost estimator language and put it into different buckets that more align with how DoD cost estimators tend to organize their work. And so you'll see towards the end of the briefing today that there's a replacement for this graphic. I think this is a good place to start for understanding the concepts, but it can lead you to kind of, okay, well, I get in general what you're trying to do, but how do I go do that in cost estimate? So we're going to build our way up to that slide later on, but hopefully this was a good intro. And our next slide here is going to get into the more specific terminology that'll get us ready to use this in a cost estimate. So this is our terminology warm-up slide. And I'll warn you now, this is going to be the most boring part of the briefing because I'm just going to read the slide to you. But one of the things that has made it difficult to roll this material out to people is that everyone's using different words and it's hard to communicate that way. So we're going to get everybody onto the same field in terms of words here before we get into the handbook material. So first, indices. They might measure inflation or escalation. Again, inflation is economy-wide and escalation is commodity-specific. DoD specifically uses the GDP price index for inflation. We're required to use that, and that's something that OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, publishes on the White House website every year. So that is the one and only inflation index. It's like the Highlander, there is only one. Anything else is an escalation index, and that's where you're talking about this commodity-specific changes. So that could be like an aircraft parts index or engineering labor index, that kind of thing. Up next, we've got obligations, which are for budget outputs, and expenditures, which are a common input type. So given the audience that I'm talking to today, you probably mostly think in terms of expenditures. That's where you're saying, I am spending this money at this particular point in time. That's a little bit different from how government cost estimators have to put things together because we're planning for a budget. And in our budget, we're saying, I'm going to get an appropriation that I'm going to spend over an extended period of time. So before I'm done spending this appropriation, the prices are going to go up and going to go down. And so I need to account for how much I think I'm going to need to spend at some point in the future. And the way that they do that is for obligations, we build in an outlay profile, which says for any given appropriation, which might be like an aircraft procurement appropriation or RDT&E for the Navy, whatever appropriation has a spending pattern associated with it. It's just a percentage per year over time. And so that tells us, if I'm going to spend most of my money 2 years from now, then it really matters what prices are going to look like 2 years from now. And I build that into my costs. So that's the difference between the two. Obligations include that outlay profile and expenditures don't. Now we're about halfway down the slide, and this is where we start to introduce our dollar type language. So then year dollars, TY dollars, have real world significance, whereas constant year and constant price are normalized for analytical purposes. So then year dollars are, I'm actually going to the store, I'm going to pay a bill from a contractor in then year dollars, real world significance. Constant year and constant price are just, I'm doing some analysis and I need to bring everything down to a common point. Then year dollars might represent obligations or expenditures. So that gives you two different flavors of then year dollars, whether an outlay profile is included or not. If you remove inflation from then year obs, you get constant year obs. And if you remove inflation from then year expenditures, you get constant year expenditures. So that gives you two different flavors of constant year dollars. So some of you may have heard, thinking back to that self-assessment slide at the beginning, you might be thinking in terms of then year and base year dollars. Or maybe you have heard of then year, constant year, and constant price, but not this difference between obligations and expenditures. And so this is where some people's heads explode when they hear that there are actually $5 types here. You've got them listed in the middle of the slide. It doesn't have to be too much of a brain exploding thing. I think the difficult thing is to move from base year to constant year and constant price. But this addition of the obligations versus expenditures flavor is really just a calculations difference. The theory and kind of conceptual piece of it isn't too difficult to grasp, and we're going to get into that as we go through. But the fact that there are these 5 different dollar types actually makes it easier to write flowcharts and instructions for people, because the difference between them is based on whether you are going to use a raw or a weighted index. So I think people were getting really confused about when do I use raw or weighted. This is where we get down to the next bullet here. But weighted indices include that outlay profile that we were talking about, accounting for the fact that I'm not going to spend all this money at one point in time. I need to account for how prices are going to change before I'm done spending it. So weighted indices have a factor built in that will account for that for you, whereas raw indices just say, for this individual point in time, this is what the prices are doing. So you'll use weighted indices with obligations, whether then year or constant year, and you'll use raw indices with expenditures. So since I know I'm talking to mostly contractors here, you probably don't need to think too much about obligations and outlay profiles. Most of what you're doing is likely to be expenditures, but it's important to know the difference because you will see these different terms in any DoD tools you use. Last bullet on this slide is about base year dollars. So again, thinking back to the self-assessment, if you thought you were at level 2, which had the base year dollars and then year dollars piece, the latest handbook cancels the existence of base year dollars. So we don't want people to use that anymore, but the term base year by itself does still exist. The reason for this is that there's a problem with base year dollars. It's ambiguous because I can't tell whether you got to that value using an inflation index or an escalation index. People would just kind of grab whatever index somebody told them to use 5 years ago and they haven't really thought about it since then, and just, I normalized it, here's my base year, I'm done. But I can't tell whether you used inflation or escalation, whether that result is constant year or constant price. And that does affect how I can use that number or any calculations I want to do on it from that point forward. And so we want people to use constant year and constant price because it's more precise and it will tell me exactly what kind of index you used. But you will still see the term base year because that exists in the broader field of economics. And so the base year is just whatever year you're normalizing to. And so if you are normalizing to 2008 for whatever reason, if that's the last year of the baseline you're comparing against, like for a Nunn-McCurdy breach kind of situation, 2008 is your base year, but you could normalize to constant year 08 or constant price 08. So the 08 is still your base year piece. We just want you to specify what kind of index you used to get there. So this is the latest and greatest terminology for best practices. There's more precision in here, and so there are more types of terms than you might be used to seeing in the past, but it really does simplify the instruction writing piece of it, which again was the focus of our handbook update. more step-by-step instructions, quick reference guides, and all that kind of stuff. So if your brain is exploding and you're like, I don't really know what's the deal with all these different dollar types, the next slide should help because it has a picture. So here's our picture that shows a bunch of these terms in relation to each other. So I just told you about how there are 5 dollar types, and here I am showing you a graph with only 3. But that's because the 2 different types of Venn-year kind of behave like each other most of the time. And the same is true for the 2 different types of constant year. And so usually we'll talk about them kind of as groups. It only matters which one you're talking about if you're actually doing the calculations, but it simplifies things to only be looking at 3. So you can see the difference between Venn-year and constant year is inflation. Constant year to constant price is real price change, and those combine to give you escalation. If you think back to that sand chart that we saw on the first main slide, you can kind of superimpose this diagram on top of that, right? If you were to graph your historical data, it would be the green Venn-year line. And then you have different ways that you can normalize it depending on what you're trying to do. So if all you wanted to do was say, what if inflation didn't happen? And I just want to see what's going on with my particular commodity, then you'd remove inflation, and that would bring you down to the red constant year line in the middle. And then you could, look at the trends within what's left over. Or if you're doing a forecast, for example, you might want to take one point, like a subject matter expert estimate of a value, and say, what if I just stretch this all the way across every column of my Excel workbook, and I'm going to add price stuff onto it later. That would be building an estimate in constant price. And a lot of people think of that as base year dollars. So if you imagine how you would have built a cost estimate in the past using base year dollars and then add inflation escalation on top of that value later, you're basically building a constant price model. So the functions haven't really changed in terms of how you build a model and how you might want to normalize historical data. It's just making sure that you are using the right kind of index so that you're moving from whatever line you're on to the correct line for that type of analysis. So the goal of the handbook is to help you figure out what line are you on, what line do you want to be on, and how do you go from one to the other. And that's really the entire handbook is trying to spell that out. Now the picture that's on here shows what things look like when real price change is positive, but that doesn't have to be the case. And so the little graphs on the bottom just show that if you have negative real price change or 0 real price change, or depending on the magnitude of it relative to inflation, things can look a little bit different. The calculations are the same no matter what, so you don't have to worry about it too much. But if you graph your data and it looks kind of funny to you, you can compare it to all these pictures and it'll help you put that information into context. So let's go through an example that I think will make these lines make more sense. And we're going to start with a military pay example. So our question is, given a military member's salary of $120,000 in FY 2020, what will the person's salary be in 2030 in both Venn-year expenditures and constant year 20 expenditures? And so what we're doing here, if you look at the graph at the bottom, is we were given this value of $120,000. And if I'm building this into a cost estimate and I want to know how much is my military pay bill going to be in 2030, I might take that latest salary value and just stretch it all the way across my workbook. So every year from 2020 to 2030 is going to have that same value. Now, I know that that person is not actually going to be paid $120,000 in each of those years. It's going to change. And so I need to go up to Venn-year dollars using the military pay escalation index. So I go grab that value off of my table and I multiply it. And that brings me from 120 times that MILPAY index that's circled to get me 161,268. So this same person doing the same job is going to be paid 161,000 10 years in the future, or 11 years in the future. So that's the real world significance, what somebody's actually going to be paid, what actually needs to go into a budget for this person. And then we have this extra step of needing to calculate constant year values. So that's where we're just taking inflation away. So we start with that green value, the 161 that we already calculated, and we remove inflation from it. So now we're looking at the GDP price index and dividing the number out, and that gets us to 132,000 in this case. So it used to be that people would just think, oh, I'm doing a military pay estimate. So I'm going to use the military pay index, and that's all I need to know. But if you only use the MILPAY index, then you would bounce back and forth from 120 to 161 back to 120 again. You wouldn't calculate this value in the middle that shows what happens if only inflation is taken away. This is showing that military pay salaries are changing at a rate that's different from inflation itself. So it just gives you an extra point of comparison to say relative to the entire economy, what is that value going to be? And this brings us to the key best practice of the handbook in the bottom right of the screen, which is to build your models in constant price. That's kind of standard practice, the way we've always built cost estimates. Then escalate to then-year dollars. So that brings you all the way up to the top using escalation indices that predict the real world price of a thing in the future. And then as a very last step at the end, kind of an afterthought, deflate to constant year. And all that's for is to give you a point of comparison for that number. So you go constant price to then year to constant year. You're not moving directly between constant price and constant year. You have this kind of stop point in the middle. It simplifies the calculations to do it that way, even though it's 2 steps. Trust me, it's better. But that's kind of how these come into play when you have this collection of many indices. When do you multiply, when do you divide, by which type of index? It just depends what you're trying to calculate and what kind of commodity you're looking at. So you might be wondering, okay, well, what does that 132,000 value mean? Like, does that have any significance? If that's not what I need to put into a budget, then why do I need it in the first place? And that brings us to our next slide here, which is when to use all the different dollar types. So we'll start with constant price here, and that is recommended for any kind of intermediate calculations. This is what we think of as the interesting stuff of cost estimating, when you're averaging things together and making judgment calls about, you know, here I want to use a 3-year average, here I want to use a 6-year average, whatever, that kind of average cost factor, CERs, cost improvement curves, or if you're looking for programmatic trends, so changes in quantity and quality of something over time. You want to take all of the escalation, all of the price variation out before you start doing math on things. And the reason for that is pretty much for the same reason that it ever made sense to normalize your data. You want to take variation out so you can do your calculations and then add things back in as appropriate. But you need to make sure that everything is, for example, in the same dollars, you know, referencing the same base year. All those kinds of standard reasons that you'd want to normalize things are the reason that you want to use constant price, because it is the most normalized of all the dollar types, taking out the full rate of escalation. But we don't recommend using constant price for reporting final values. So this is really a kind of a working level tool that we use, constant price, for building our cost models, but they don't have much meaning outside of the DoD cost community because they don't have real world significance, right? Those are the then year values. And if I have a collection of a lot of constant price values, I can't just add them together and have them make any sense. If you think about a cost estimate that might have 50 different rows for 50 different cost elements. You've got a propulsion system here and a labor category there, and this is raw material for this other thing. If you pick a specific escalation index for each of those rows, then everything's going to be normalized relative to a different index. And you can't just add them back together because it's like they're in different units. And so sending a report out beyond the DoD cost community that doesn't provide that context would confuse people. And so constant price is really for doing calculations and the kind of day-to-day business of cost estimating, but not for external reports. The next row on here is for then year obligations and constant year obligations, and that's the exact opposite of the previous one. So we want to use then year obs and constant year obs for reporting final values if we're doing total costs of a program, or if we're building a budget, in APB, SAR, AOA, BCA, pretty much all of the analyses that government cost estimators do are going to be in then year obligations. And the reason for that is because most of our stuff is headed into budget decisions anyway. And since budgets use obligations, we want to make sure we're talking the same language as the budget people. But we don't want to use those for intermediate calculations. Again, this is the opposite of constant price. And the reason for that is that then your obligations include escalation over time. Constant year obligations include real price change over time. And so if I take those numbers and start averaging them together, then I'm going to bake in some amount of variation from those values into the average, which may or may not be appropriate. And so it's better to take that stuff out before you start doing math. Really, the only thing you want to do with those is add them together or subtract them, same type of dollars. Like if you have a portfolio of multiple programs, you can add them together, but don't start multiplying things. And then at the bottom of the table for then year expenditures and constant year expenditures, we really only see those as input types for what we're talking about as government cost estimators. Knowing that I'm mostly briefing contractors today, this graph is a little bit different for you because you're probably just reporting things out of your accounting systems saying I spent this money at this particular point in time. And so those are then year expenditures. And we know to treat your data as then year expenditures when we use it as an input type. Just know that what we are doing on our end is taking those inputs and converting things into the appropriate type for whatever analysis we're doing. But I think the concept of constant price and how to move between these values is still useful for you as you think about, I'm building my model in constant price and I'm going to add some price changing factor on top of it, which would be escalation. So the basics are still in effect, but this gives you a sense of what the government side at least is doing. We're trying to generate then year obligations and do our comparisons in that language. So my next slide is going to kind of summarize this terminology before we get into the handbook contents itself. So if your head is exploding and you're thinking, I don't know how to make sense of all these different dollar types and how to move around, this is kind of how I think about it. It's like an iceberg. And so you can see the labels on here correspond to what we've already been talking about so far. And the top of the iceberg is inflation. This is the piece that's easy to see because it's the same for everybody. Again, inflation is just measuring the change in value of the US dollar over time. So everybody's using the same US dollars to pay for things. So that gives us only one rate of inflation. Same for everybody, easy to measure, easy to include in an estimate. The OMB publishes it on the White House website. There's no question this is inflation right here. So that's the easy piece. But for any given commodity, you've got this extra piece of the iceberg that's beneath the surface, and that's harder to characterize. And that's where we're talking about real price change. So if I have some weapon system, it depends at what level of detail I'm dividing out the WBS. It might depend on the stage of the life cycle that I'm in, how much detail I have, how much time I have to do the analysis. So I could be talking about the total weapon system level or subsystem level, or maybe specific material types or labor categories. Whatever it is, though, each of those things can be experiencing real price change. Thinking back to that sand chart at the beginning, you can have specific market prices, contractor business effects, and those government decisions about quality and quantity changes. All of those things can be affecting the price that I'm actually going to pay for that weapon system or for that commodity. And it's harder to characterize that. I don't know at what level of detail I should look. I don't know how to go out and interpret all these different economist tools. And maybe there's 50 different steel indices that are out there. How am I supposed to know which of these steel indices is most applicable to my estimate? And that's where analyst judgment comes into play. And CAPE is working on some research to try to provide more guidance on how to characterize that bottom of the iceberg. But that is kind of the big question, is how do I describe what the rest of the iceberg looks like for any given commodity? We do have a handful of escalation indices within DoD that are handed to us. And these are the ones that Comptroller publishes. And so those are easy because in the case of MILPAY and CivPay, the DoD controls what those prices are going to be. Like, we are in control of that market. It's a policy decision. And so it's easy for us to say this is going to be the full rate of escalation on those pieces over time. Or in the case of fuel, obviously we don't control the fuel market, but it's just sort of a pricing mechanism, like a ground rule used in budgets. And so we all use those escalation indices, and that makes it easy for those commodities because Comptroller is saying, here you go, this is the MILPAY rate throughout the FIDEP, just use it, it's escalation. And because those are talking about specific commodities, they're escalation indices. But everything else that you might have seen in a DoD tool, let's say you're familiar with the Joint Inflation Calculator that has the Navy and Army indices, or the inflation function that NavAir and AFCA use. Those tools that DoD produces have a lot of indices in them that sound like they have commodity-specific names. So you can see in the top right of the slide here, you'll see in those tools things that are labeled RDT&E Navy, Aircraft Procurement Air Force, O&M Reserve Navy, or whatever it is. But just because those have fancy names that sound like they are escalation because they're for a specific thing, if you look at the way they're actually built, they're only inflation indices. If you line up all the raw indices next to each other, you'll see that they're the same. It's because they're all built off of just inflation. The only time you'll see them different from each other is if you're looking at the weighted versions. So the weighted versions of those indices will have the appropriation specific outlay profiles put on top of inflation. So the RDT&E Navy index is going to use the overall inflation index, that same one we've been talking about since the beginning, with the RDT&E Navy outlay profile, that spending pattern over time laid on top of it. And so I think this has confused a lot of people because they look at those tools and think, oh, I'm doing an RDT&E cost element, so just going to use this index and it must have everything that I want. But we've been trying to communicate to people that those are really only inflation, and you could be missing that bottom of the iceberg beneath the surface real price change piece. And so this is where we want people to understand the differences and make sure that they're including everything they need for their estimates. And as we get people more comfortable with the terminology and understanding the importance of doing this, we're also working on building more tools to make it a little easier and to try to standardize things across cost estimates. Because if every individual analyst is going out and finding escalation indices for steel, and you got 50 different steel escalation indices available to you, then if we're all picking different ones, it's just going to be a nightmare. And so if we can think about, in general, for DoD commodities, what's the most appropriate for what we're doing, I think the end goal is to generate some kind of a library. So it's sort of a starting point and a standardization mechanism for everybody across the DoD to use those things. But for right now, we mostly talk in terms of MILPAY, CivPay, fuel, and there's also a medical index the comptroller publishes. But the goal is to be able to characterize this entire iceberg for all the commodities that the DoD is interested in. And we're just going to kind of do that as we have time, as we can complete the research and share it with each other and think through things like how might steel be different between different weapon systems and how should I capture that differently. So we're still kind of working on that piece of it, but it's been a challenge just to get this terminology out to people. And so I appreciate getting the invite for giving this briefing today to keep rolling out that information to all of you. And so now that we've talked about the basics with the terminology and the theory, I'll talk briefly about our handbook so you know where to go looking for more information. So I mentioned that the difference between inflation and escalation first came out in the 2015 timeframe. And so CAPE came out with a really short, about 10-page handbook, the green cover on the left, in 2016. And that introduced the terms of escalation and real price change in general. And then a year later followed up with the 2017 version, which was about 80 pages. So going from 10 to 80, expanding on that theory and giving some applications. So that's where that sand chart initially lived, to explain what do we really mean by real price change? How can I start thinking about including it? But it didn't have a lot of step-by-step instructions for people that were really in the context of a DoD cost estimate. They were more from an economist's perspective. And so in 2021, in December, we finally published our update, which added those step-by-step instructions and started to split out things like the obligations versus expenditures difference, things that actually make it easier to draw these out in flowcharts. So you'll see those clarified definitions that help with implementation in our handbook. And the current version is a whopping 124 pages, but there is an interactive clickable table of contents at the beginning. And so you should be able to navigate pretty quickly to whatever section you need for what you're looking at the time. So I mentioned these step-by-step instructions in the flow charts. I've been teasing those since the beginning. So let's give you a quick peek inside. We're not going to talk about them in too much detail, but this is what they look like. So you can go find them yourself. So these are our flow charts. There's the caret chart in the top left, which tells you, I have a number in front of me. What kind of dollar is this? So it's for input diagnosis. That's what the caret chart gives you. On the right side, the pitchfork chart is my personal favorite, and it tells you, okay, so you figured out what kind of input you have. That's along the top row of the pitchfork. And what do you do from that point until you're done with your cost estimate? For all the different phases of completing a cost estimate, what dollar type should you be in and how do you get there? So I like the pitchfork chart the best because it's directional. It shows for a typical cost estimate what we're doing at each step along the way. And then finally, in the bottom left, you have the nunchuck chart, which is not for a typical cost estimate for any kind of calculation. So if you're doing some kind of random type of side project that's not quite like a cost estimate, all you need to do for the nunchuck chart is put one finger on your starting dollar type and another finger on where you want to end up, and it will tell you how to multiply and divide and by what type of index to get from point A to point B. And so you'll see on here, again, we're not going to brief these in detail today, just in the interest of time, but you'll see things like the three main dollar types. You've got then your constant price. You've got the difference between obligations and expenditures, and that labeling helps you see when to use a weighted index and when to use a raw. So each of these flowcharts has an entire chapter in the handbook. So the caret chart is chapter 4 on inputs, pitchfork is 5 for outputs, and nunchuck is 6 for indices. Then there's another chapter that talks about actual calculations, just when do you multiply, when do you divide, how do you find the right row of the index? What happens if you have an input that is for a 3-year period of performance? What year do you treat it as? All that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of step-by-step practical application instructions in there. Each of the arrows that's on these flowcharts will have like a whole paragraph explaining what you're doing and why. So it's really meant to stand alone by itself. This briefing is just to introduce its existence so you can go through and read it at your own pace and as you need particular pieces of information. Another graphic I want to show you real quickly is the thing that replaced our sand chart. And so you can see in the top left a little reminder on what that sand chart looked like. So I think the sand chart is really helpful for understanding conceptually what real price change means. That was the specific market prices, contractor business effects, and the program content changes over time. But those aren't really the buckets that we use as cost estimators. And so this new version splits them into buckets that might look more familiar from a cost estimating perspective. So you start on the left side, you've got escalation, then that breaks down into inflation and real price change. And there's a little interactive element between the two of them. That only really matters if you're trying to show a sand chart, so I haven't talked about it much. But then within real price change, you can break things out in different ways depending on what you're estimating. So a common way to do that is labor versus materials. If you have enough detail to split those apart, then that's generally a good idea. And then within each of those, we have quantity, quality, and pricing changes. And so you can see on the right side some examples of what we consider quantity and quality changes. And the focus of this briefing has really been on the pricing side. So this can be tailored to different levels of detail depending on how much time you have to do your analysis. Sometimes, for example, if we're looking at data from a subcontractor, those are usually treated as material to the prime. And so we might not be able to split labor and materials out from each other. And we just have to kind of think through that for individual analyses. But this gives people kind of an overarching view of where these functions that cost estimators do kind of fit into the bigger picture. And the reason that we show it this way is because we were getting some arguments from people where they'd say, oh, I don't need to use an escalation index because I already did a learning curve on this. But those aren't really the same thing. So a learning curve you can see in the top blue box on the right is accounting for labor changes in quantity, how many hours over time. It's not taking price changes into account. And so those are separate pieces. And I think this graphic helps people see what they're doing in different parts of their estimate and make sure that they're capturing everything. Even if they have to kind of roll some pieces together, that's fine as long as you use this as a brainstorming tool to make sure you're capturing everything that's relevant to your project. And so with that, I'm going to circle us back to our self-assessment slide. So this is the last slide of the day, and then I'll take some questions. So we started out with this, and probably a lot of people were in level 2 and level 3. Level 4 is new. So this is what we unlocked with the publication of the 2021 handbook. So that was, again, splitting from $3 types into 5. which was the biggest change of this handbook, but made it easier to draw flowcharts. But really nobody is at level 5, at least not on a consistent basis. And so CAPE is doing some research to try to get all of us there, but it's going to be a community effort across the whole cost community. So that's where we're not just using the same terminology across the board, which has been enough of a challenge by itself, but really figuring out of those 50 different steel indices, which one should I use for my particular analysis? That's hard because it's not really cost estimating, it's more economics. And there aren't a lot of people who have experience in both of them, at least within the DoD cost community. You usually get kind of one set of experiences or the other. And so we need to bring a lot of people together in a working group and think through those problems and provide more guidance on that. But for now, we're kind of reaching back to people from all these different levels to try to get everybody at least to level 4. So we're using the same words to talk about these concepts. And then we're going to work together to get those, that library of indices built out to make all of this a little bit easier. So with that, I've left 14 minutes for questions. I see a bunch have populated into the chat, but I don't think that I can read them myself. So at least for now, thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take your questions.
Thanks, Erica. We do have a bunch of them. A couple of them are, can government contractors download these manuals, and from where, if so, or if not, how do they get a hold of them?
So the Inflation Escalation Handbook is on our public website. So I'm backing up to the title slide here. So this is the CAPE public website, or you can just Google OSD CAPE. It'll be the first thing that pops up. So under the public reports link at the top, you'll see the Inflation Escalation Handbook there. And I believe the slides from today will be available on the OEM COG website too.
That's right. The slides for today, as well as today's recording, will be up on the OEM COG site by around lunchtime tomorrow. Okay, so we have another question that's about slide 5. So good thing you're at the front here. Terminology says that escalation equals commodity specific, but slide 4 indicated that escalation includes inflation, specific market prices, contact, or business effects. Can you clarify?
So yeah, escalation, the reason we say commodity specific for escalation is primarily because of the real price change pieces of it, as opposed to inflation. So it's kind of like the real price change piece of it is what I would say is commodity specific. But since that factors into escalation, it kind of confers that commodity specific essence of the real price change to escalation as well. And most of the time when you're looking at an escalation index, it isn't going to break those apart for you. It's just going to be like, this is the price of steel over time. And so the inflation piece of it is baked into the cake. And so if you're talking about the entire index, then it is commodity specific.
Okay, then we got one. I'm not sure if this got answered. Hold on. If there are constant year and constant price dollars, real dollars, then why aren't there then year and then price dollars, normal dollars? If then price isn't a thing, then how should one distinguish between nominal dollars that are adjusted using inflation alone and real price change?
So I think I'm going to answer that using this 3-line graphic. So I'm not sure that I followed all of it. One thing that I will say about terminology in general is that, like in that question, you heard something about nominal dollars and real dollars. Those are terms that economists use. It's kind of a beyond DoD term. Nominal dollars is then year. That is the real world significance value, whereas real dollars are adjusted for something. So real dollars, it depends whether you're looking at DoD guidance or non-DoD stuff, I think is where this comes into play. So economists will take nominal dollars, again, then year real world significance values, and apply indices to them. And that's just kind of a normal course of business as an economist. Now, that doesn't specify whether they're using an inflation index or an escalation index, so it kind of recreates the base year dollars terminology issue to talk in those terms, because I wouldn't be able to tell you what index they use to produce that real dollars value. Even just the term real dollars has always irritated me because it's the one that doesn't have real world significance. So it's kind of like the opposite of what you'd think it should be. But so I guess the closest comparison to real dollars is base year dollars. And the reason that economists don't necessarily need to differentiate between whether they use an inflation index or an escalation index is because I think for the most part, people are just using escalation indices. But it depends on what they're trying to do and what they're trying to communicate. But this is also why you only really hear people talk about inflation in general terms. If you think about a news report, a common thing that you'll hear is something along the lines of wages are up since last year, but if you account for inflation, they're down. And so in order to make a statement like that, you need a combination of escalation and inflation indices. So in order to say wages are up since last year, that means real world significance escalation index about wages is what got me there, right? So wages are up, but if you adjust for inflation, they're down. So you need to remove only inflation from that and leave in the wage specific real price change. And so what you've done in this calculation is use an escalation index to forecast into the future, and then an inflation index to get down to constant year. And people make those statements without saying specifically constant year or constant price or even real dollars necessarily, because they're just trying to conceptually convey something to you. But we have to use more precise language than that when we're actually building models, because somebody needs to go review what I've done. And I need to make sure I'm communicating the right things to people and labeling graphs and tables correctly. And so that's why we make the distinction between the constant year and constant price, because they're useful for different things. But if we weren't making that distinction, we wouldn't be able to say wages are up, but adjusted for inflation, they're down, or something like that. Because if we only ever used escalation indices, then we would just say wages are up, but if they hadn't gone up, they'd be the same. Like, well, that's not really a useful piece of information. And so that's why we have the inflation adjusted values, the constant year thing. That's what that gives us. So you are kind of seeing echoes of it beyond the DoD cost community. They're just not using such precise language that we need to use to communicate about it. So hopefully that answered the question of why the terminology exists the way that it does.
It seems almost like a follow-up-ish question. If inflation is the same for everybody, why does CAPE publish appropriation-specific inflation, not escalation indices, by appropriation with different columns for the raw, not just weighted indices?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to my iceberg chart. So OSD actually doesn't publish those indices at all. It's the services that do that. So we're talking about the joint inflation calculator and the inflation function from NAVAIR and AFCA. So it has actually been a pet peeve of mine that all of those do what you just said in the question. So if you look at those tools, you'll see a massive table of raw indices and a massive table of weighted indices. And it gives the impression that they are escalation indices because they have specific names to them. If I look at the ammunition index from the Army piece of the JIC, then I'm thinking, oh, this is capturing something specific about ammunition. That's perfect for this cost element, just going to use it, not even think about it anymore. But I think that's misleading because if you look at the way it's built, it's actually just inflation. If you look at the ammunition raw index next to the aircraft procurement raw index, next to pretty much anything else that's not MILPAY, CivPay, fuel, they'll all be the same as each other because they're just inflation. So I think it is misleading the way that those tools name things, but it's also, they exist that way to make it easy for people to reference. And so I see why that kind of came to be that way, but I think it has slowed down the adoption of a lot of this terminology. And so I'm working on building some tools now. I mentioned how CAPE is doing research into building an index library. So I have a tool now that's going to show, instead of a massive table of raw indices and a massive table of weighted indices, it's going to be a small table of raw indices. Right now, it would just be inflation, MILPAY, CivPay, fuel, only 4. And then a table of outlay profiles. And what the tool will do is mix and match them so that you can build a weighted index off of any raw and combination of the outlay profile. So I think that'll make it clearer to people what's actually happening to build those indices. But you're right, that huge table of raw indices is mostly repeating the same thing over and over under different names.
Okay, then we have another question that says, it used to be that the difference between cost and price was fee. Is that changing?
That is not changing. So that's kind of a different bucket of information. I talked about how that CAPE public website where the handbook lives has a bunch of other handbooks as well. So the DoD cost estimating guide, operations and support. So this is just kind of a little microcosm within cost estimating, and it's not directly related to contracting things. And so when we talk about constant price, we don't really mean, we mean price in like an economic sense, not in a contracting sense. And so when CAPE came out with the 2016 handbook, they had to come up with some name for the dollar that people were creating. And so they picked constant price. But it doesn't directly correlate to price, as you just said in the question.
Okay, I'm just gonna pull up. We got another question: if the guidance will be available to the industry as well. That at least one service now considers inflation indices as CUI, which limits access.
Yeah, so I'm aware of the CUI problem, and that is because the comptroller that puts the indices together did kind of a review of all their products back when FOUO changed to CUI and determined that the rates should be CUI when they're deliberative. And so there's a period of time in between the comptroller publishing them and when they get into the public green book where they are CUI. And so that's why the tools haven't been available online. It's not really within CAPE's control to be able to change those markings, but there might be some ways that we can publish, for example, all the historical indices and just keep the forward-looking ones kind of behind the sign-in wall. And so there have to be some workarounds so that we can get people the information that they need, but we are aware of that change. That came kind of out of nowhere. It makes sense to me why they'd want to mark deliberative budget information as CUI. That's one of the CUI categories. So we'll just have to think about how to kind of make sure that people get everything that they need, but we are working on that.
All right, and I think this is the last question we're going to have time for. Sorry, folks, for those of you who weren't able to get to your questions. We're back on slide 7. In the example on slide 7, the GDP price is always increasing. How do you handle commodities like oil where the price fluctuates up and down? Are there specific price indices for each commodity?
So the GDP price index, we use all notional indices throughout the handbook. And so this is just based on a 2% per year thing for the GDP and 3% per year, I think, for the MILPAY. So that's just notional to be able to show these numbers in a publicly releasable format in the handbook. If you have an index that is jumping all over the place, like fuel is a good example, all the calculations behave exactly the same way. You still multiply at all the same times, divide at all the same times. The mechanics of the calculations don't care what the index value is, but that's why I showed back on this slide here, the graph might look different depending on what those rates actually are, and it will depend on whether you're looking at a time before or after the base year that you're normalizing things to. So I think the 3-line graphic at the top is useful as just kind of one thing to burn into your memory or tattoo on your wrists for easy reference. But it could look like a bunch of different things. And so I was getting a lot of questions from people like, I did this calculation and my constant year came out more than my then year. Can this possibly be right? And so I'd have to double check and look at some things. And the answer is, yeah, sometimes constant year is greater than then year. It just depends on where you are time-wise and what those rates are. But again, the actual mechanics, the calculations of it, it doesn't matter what the index is doing. It'll just look different if you were to graph it.
That's all the time we had for Q&A for today, so you can get to your 1 o'clocks. I want to thank everybody for coming, and thank you, Erica, for presenting for us. I hope we get to hear the rest of you again in September when Brent Johnstone is going to present his 2022 Best Paper Overall winning paper, Second Source Manufacturing: Lessons from the Second Cold War. Second World War. Interesting. Sorry. And if you have questions for the OEM COG or topics you'd like to suggest for future webinars, or you want to get more involved, email us at ICEAA@ICEAonline.org. Thanks again, Erica. Thanks, John, for starting us off. And thanks, everybody, for coming today. Have a great rest of your days.
Thank you, everyone.